Hello and welcome back to our final Camtasia lecture video dealing with Chapter 2, which is job order costing, calculating unit product costs. Now, up to this point, we have learned everything we need to look at multiple predetermined overhead rates. Okay? Um, Using multiple predetermined overhead rates is not very different from using a plant-wide predetermined overhead rate. The only thing we need to recognize is that when we deal with multiple predetermined overhead rates, each department is going to have its predetermined overhead rate. Okay, so let's go ahead and just kind of look at a quick example here. So we have Dixon Company, right? They have two production departments. They got a milling department and an assembly department. Because they produce multiple products within a period, and we're going to assume that these products are produced to customer specifications, they use job order costing. And they compute the predetermined overhead rate in each production department. That means that we have multiple predetermined overhead rates, one for milling and then one for assembly. Okay, they tell us that the predetermined overhead rate in the milling department is based on machine hours, and in the assembly department the predetermined overhead rate is based on direct labor hours. Now, they're using two different allocation bases for each department. That makes sense, okay? And here's why. Let's assume, if you hopefully think back, we said that, you know what, whenever we're picking our cost driver, whatever cost driver we choose has to be based on the costs, it has to be based on what are driving those costs in that manufacturing overhead. So they tell us that the milling department is based on machine hours. So that must mean all their overhead cost for that department is a result of using machines. So it would probably be a good idea for us to use an allocation base of machine hours to allocate that overhead. Conversely, with the assembly department, they say assembly department is based on direct labor hours. So that must mean that their manufacturing overhead, that a lot of that has to do with direct labor hours. Okay, they tell us that the company uses a cost plus pricing. So they mark up the price of the product based on 75% of the cost, right? So they take the cost, whatever that cost is, multiply it by 75%, that's the price. So that's how they establish the selling price for each job. They tell us that at the beginning of the year, this company made the following estimates, right? Notice what we have here: the milling department and the assembly department. And we have all the data that is specific to each department. Look at milling. Milling uses 60,000 machine hours as opposed to assembly's 3,000. So since there's more use of the machines in the milling department, all the indirect manufacturing overhead costs are probably related to those machines. Okay, look at the direct labor hours used: 8,000 hours in the milling department compared to 80,000 in the assembly department. So the assembly department is very heavily uses direct labor hours. So chances are that that manufacturing overhead that we have is made up of all our indirect labor costs. Okay, they give us the total fixed manufacturing overhead costs per department. They also give us the variable manufacturing overhead based on machine hours, and they give us the variable manufacturing overhead per direct labor hour. Okay, so we have all the data we need. So what we need to do, step one, right? The steps are still the same for the most part. The only difference is we're applying them we're applying these steps to 2 departments as opposed to 1, right? The plant-wide is the one department, so to speak. So step 1, we got to calculate the predetermined overhead cost for each department. Not a problem, right? Remember, to do this, we need to use our mixed cost equation, right? The y equals a plus b times x. So we already have the numbers. The milling department. Milling department has fixed manufacturing overhead cost of $390,000 plus the variable portion, which is $2 per machine hours times 60,000 machine hours, gives us $510,000. That right there is the total estimated manufacturing overhead for the milling department. Do the same thing for the assembly department. We take our fixed assembly department overhead costs plus our variable assembly department overhead costs, right? 500,000 is the fixed plus $3.75 per direct labor hour times the number of direct labor hours used or estimated that we're going to use. So for assembly department, we get a total estimated manufacturing overhead cost of $800,000. We're halfway there. So the next thing we need to do is figure out, okay, what is the predetermined overhead rate, right? That's step 2. Calculate that predetermined overhead rate. This time we're doing it for 2 departments. So in order to do that, we already figured out what the total estimated manufacturing overhead costs are for each department, and we know what the estimated driver is for each department. We just divide, right? So for the milling department, we take the total estimated manufacturing overhead costs of $510,000 and divide it by the estimated cost driver, which is 60,000 machine hours. That means that in the milling department, we're going to apply overhead of $8.50 per machine hour. For the assembly department, we do the same exact thing, right? What are our total estimated manufacturing overhead costs? $800,000. We divide that by the estimated total cost driver. In this case, it's 80,000 direct labor hours. We divide the two, and we see that for the assembly department, we apply manufacturing overhead at a rate of $10 per direct labor hour used. Okay? So now we go ahead and we can actually calculate the amount of overhead that we apply to the jobs, right? Just like we did before, the step is still the same. We still have to calculate the amount of overhead applied, but now we have to do it for both departments, right? Because a job goes through 2 departments. So we know that for job 407 requires 90 hours or 90 machine hours in the milling department, and in the assembly department it requires 4 machine hours. Okay, direct labor hours, well, in the milling department this job utilizes 5. In the assembly department this job utilizes 20 direct labor hours. Okay, and they give us the amount of direct material that each department adds to the job, as well as the direct labor costs that each department adds to the job. Okay, so now we can apply the overhead. Remember, the milling department bases their direct labor, bases their allocation on machine hours. Okay, so to apply overhead from the milling department to this job, we need to first say, okay, how many machine hours did we use for this job? 90. Great. We need to multiply that by the predetermined overhead rate for the milling department, which we already figured out was $8.50. Multiply those. We're going to add $765, or let me rephrase that. We're going to apply $765 of manufacturing overhead from the milling department. Do the same thing for assembly. Now, what is the cost driver for assembly? It's direct labor hours. We could tell by the chart that the assembly department uses a lot more direct labor hours. They use 20 as opposed to 4 machine hours. Okay, so we're going to take our cost driver, which for the assembly department again is the direct labor hours, and we're going to multiply it by that predetermined overhead rate of the assembly department, which is $10 per direct labor. So we see now that for the assembly department, we're going to apply the overhead of that assembly department of $200. Okay, and then we can figure out what the total cost is of the job, which is the fourth step. So we take all the direct material costs from both departments, the direct labor costs from both departments, and then we take the manufacturing overhead applied from both departments, and we add everything up, and we see we get a total cost for job 407 as $2,485. Okay, so step 5 in this example says, oh, by the way, we got to mark up our costs, right? Why? Because we're trying to get a selling cost, right? Think about it this way. Somebody comes to us and she says, hey, I want you to do this job for me, right? We need to make something. It has to go through milling and assembly department. It's a widget, for lack of a better term. Okay, how much you going to charge me for that, right? So we all get together and we say, okay, we got to figure out a price. Well, we already know what our costs are, right? Total cost of the job is $24.85, right? We cannot charge her $24.85 because that only covers our production costs, right? Or our manufacturing costs, right? We still have other costs that we want to cover, and you know what else? We want a profit, right? We want to pay ourselves. If we just charge $24.85, that would just cover the cost of making the product. It wouldn't give us a profit. So we said, you know what? We're going to mark up that job 75% of the cost. Great. So we take the cost and then we multiply it by 75%. 75% of our cost is $1,863.75. So the selling price for this job, meaning the price that the client is going to pay us, is $4,348.75. Okay? Keep in mind now that we used multiple predetermined overhead rates. Okay? If we would have used the plant-wide rate based on either direct labor hours or machine hours, we would get a totally different cost structure, right? Because we would be applying overhead based on either machine hours or direct labor hours, right? This method allows us to get multiple predetermined overhead rates, and this allows us to get more accurate costs that the job causes. Okay, so this is better data. It's better to use multiple predetermined overhead rates, again, when you have multiple departments within the process, because that enables us to do better planning and hopefully at the end of the day make better decisions. Okay. Let's see, what else do we got here. We'll worry about underapplied and overapplied a little later. That's pretty much the end of chapter 2. Actually, you know what? Let's talk a little bit about underapplied and overapplied. So we know that we make estimates at the beginning of the period and we apply our overhead, right? At the end of the period, we find out what our actual manufacturing overhead costs were, and we find out the actual amount of that cost driver that we used. So like we saw in the previous previous problem in our study guide, there's going to be a difference. There's going to be an over applied or an under applied. Okay, so when we apply less overhead to the job than we actually incur, that means we underapplied. Okay, if we apply excuse me, more overhead to a job than we actually incurred, then we overapplied. Okay, how do we fix that? Well, there's multiple ways to fix it. Um, we could fix it by just adjusting the cost of goods sold, or we could adjust cost of goods sold and our WIP account and our finished goods account. We'll get into this a lot more in chapter 3. Right now, as long as you're okay with when we have over applied and when we have under applied, you're fine. Okay, so let's go ahead now and let's look at our, bear with me, let's look at our study guide. And I'm going to use Excel just to show you. Hold on here. Bear with me while I set this up. Okay, that should be good. I just want to use Excel. It's a little easier for me. To work through the problem. And plus too, for those of you that are using Excel for your homework, you'll get an idea of how to set up your problems. Okay, so we're going to look at exercise number 4, and this is truly exercise number 4. This is the last exercise in chapter 2, and this is the Cleveland Brown Company, right? They have 2 manufacturing departments, assembly department, and they have testing and packaging. The predetermined overhead rate in assembly and testing and packaging are $16 per direct labor hour and $12 per direct labor hour, respectively. The company's direct labor wage rate is $20 per hour, and the following pertains to job N60. So they give us the direct material cost that each department adds to this job and the direct labor cost that each department adds to the job. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to first calculate what our total cost is. Okay, so we know that we have, bear with me here. Okay, so we know we have direct material, and we know, so we know we have 2 departments, assembly, and we have testing and pack. Okay, we know we have 2 departments. We know that each department is going to add to this job, which is N-60. We know that we're going to add direct material and we're going to add direct labor. Okay, so the assembly department, how much direct labor does it add? Well, the problem tells us it's $340. Packaging, it's $25. How much labor does each department add to the job? Well, we already know that assembly adds $180 and testing and packaging does $40. Okay, so now we need to add our manufacturing overhead, but we have 2 departments, do we not? We do, and each department has its own predetermined overhead rate. For assembly, I'm going to come over here. For assembly, the predetermined overhead rate, let me adjust this column a little bit, okay, is $16. Okay, and the testing department also has a predetermined overhead rate. They already calculated it for us, of $12. So we need to apply these to each, or we need to apply $16 to the assembly. We need to apply $12 to the testing and packaging department. What is our driver? Well, it tells us that both of these departments use direct labor hours. Okay, not a problem. So we have to figure how many labor hours does each of these departments use, right? We'll think back to our last problem. Well, that's easy. If we're looking at assembly, we know that their direct labor hours is $180, and they pay their workers $20 per hour, right? That they tell us that that is the direct labor wage rate, $20. So that means if I take 180 divided by 20, I get 9 hours. Okay. Now let's look at testing. How many hours does testing use? Well, the testing department incurs a total of 40 direct labor hours. Well, we know we pay these people $20 per hour. Two. Okay, they incur 2 direct labor hours. So what I need to do now is apply apply manufacturing overhead to the assembly department. I can do that very easily. I know the assembly department predetermined overhead rate is $16. I'm going to multiply that by the amount of hours used in the assembly department, which is 9. I get $144 of manufacturing overhead that the assembly department applies to this job. I do the same thing with testing and packaging. I take my predetermined overhead rate for the testing department, which is $12. I have that here. And I multiply that by the number of hours, or the number of direct labor hours, that the testing department incurs, which is 2. I get $24. So I'm going to add all these up. I'm just going to use my sum function. Oh, did that wrong. Sorry. Equals SUM. Put my colon. I'm going to add all these. Why is that wrong? So the total cost added to the assembly department to this job is $664. Testing and packaging adds my direct labor, direct material, manufacturing overhead for the testing and packaging department, $89. So that means my total cost for this job between the two departments is $753. Okay, that is that's requirement number 1. What's the total manufacturing cost? Number 2 says, hey, if this job consists of 10 units, what's the unit product cost? That's easy, right? I take my total cost of $753 and I divide it by 10 units. And I see that the cost per unit is $75.03. Okay? We have now completed all of chapter 2, right? Hopefully now, since we just finished this problem, your study guide for chapter 2 is complete and you're ready to move on and work on either Connect or your textbook problems from chapter 2. Okay? If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to text me. I would be more than happy to set up a synchronous session through Moodle and we can talk out any questions you may have, and I can even do more demonstrations and show you how to work on a problem. Okay? So Good luck on your chapter 2 stuff. If you have any questions, I am here. You just got to reach out to me. All right. So have a good week, and we'll see you again when we come back and talk about chapter 3.